shown. So I'm going to give you a presentation about performance art and feminist identities, and present the idea of flesh as a feminist language frontier. I'm going to borrow a term from Gemma, so I am the rebel subject that we were discussing, trying to formulate new identities outside of culture. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'll crack on. I'll give you a quick introduction about myself first, to put things in context. So I am a dancer, performer, writer, cultural magpie, and a firm believer in the power of transformation through art. I search for potential catalysts constantly. Raised by two former punks, my father an armchair activist and my mother a Unitarian nurse turned part-time pagan, I was brought up in a liberal working class environment deep in the darkest wilds of Yorkshire. When I was a teenager, I hung out with a group of boys who let me in their social circle because I was into stoner rock and I could hold my own in a mosh pit. I listened to bands like Jack Off Jill and Queen Adrena, angry women who switched between screaming harpies and honey-toned cooing doves, women I would come to realise in hindsight who were in the throes of an ecstatic kind of paradox. I mostly hid my body and my sexuality under oversized jumpers bought from charity shops and woolly hats that I felt made me look as androgynous as possible. I went to an all-girls high school and from a young age identified my female body with a kind of inferred weakness or social malleability. When I was 15, I would rather have poured hot wax in my eyes than wear pink. I came to Manchester to study English and drama at Manchester University and wrote my first dissertation on the architectonics of escapism, festival culture as soul therapy, using the theories of Mikhail Bakhtin, Antonin Artaud and Richard Schnetzner as a jumping-off point to compare medieval carnival with modern festival culture. I asserted that these pop-up communities were places of potential sociological inversion and transformation, autonomous spaces where accepted norms could be scrutinised through more creative lenses. During this time, I also started to perform and met some very powerful women and men who I greatly respected. Many of them employed their own fluid notions of identity, and I saw the mechanics of gender performativity at work. They wore makeup, their bodies were provocatively on show, but they did not sacrifice their integrity as a result. In fact, quite the opposite. They used their bodies as the ultimate tool in a triumphant expression of meaning. I began to reconcile a fully rounded appreciation of what it meant to wear a feminine identity with pride, realising that my most potent sense of empowerment could come from celebrating the body I was born into, instead of rejecting it because of the psychologically crippling societal ideals I had bought into. It was important for me to understand as an artist that my body was the most limitless blank canvas I possessed. After completing my BA, I was then granted a scholarship to study performance, screen and visual studies at MA level under the guidance of Amelia Jones and Janet Wolfe, two pioneering women in the field of art history and feminist studies. The course I had chosen was a new and experimental combination of disciplines that merged art history, performance, film, gender studies, visual anthropology, metropolitan studies, theology and even archaeology. This led me to mixing units such as gender, sexuality and culture, surrealism and courses like constructions of the sacred. It was hugely broad. I even managed to write an essay about the media mythologizing of Jim Morrison as a modern day reincarnation of the god Dionysus because no parameters were set. My scope was broad and made me pay attention to the way in which culture shapes our communal and individual sense of identity on a spiritual and secular level. My MA practical dissertation was Labyrinth, an immersive theatrical project that created a literal labyrinth in the metropolis of Manchester and encouraged people, by finding clues in the architecture of the city, to uncover its spatial language as urban archaeologists and interpreters. My education has been a strange and beautiful patchwork of studies that has always veered into a rhetoric of performance, art, the ritual of subcultures, spatial legibility, and hidden or obscure discourses. Today I plan to discuss the construction of a multifaceted feminist identity through a performance art project held in May 2013 called Written in Skin, in which my partner bloodlined the poetry of strangers into my skin. Using Hélène Cixous' essay The Laugh of the Medusa and her formulation of l'écriture féminine, literally translated as women's writing or writing the female body into the text, I will argue why I believe performance art is a highly potent way to articulate a radical feminist discourse. I also suggest that the presence of masculinity, represented by my partner Loren in the piece, was a crucial factor to the project's success. The performance of Written in Skin was essentially an act of protest in response to our cultural notions of beauty and our fear of or reluctance to expose ourselves to pain. It challenged the ideas of what the female body is capable of enduring, how beauty is judged and perceived, and hoped to illuminate the transformative power of pain. Through the act of embodiment, with the understanding of flesh as an alternative language frontier, and by allowing a space for allegedly phallocentric discourses to coexist with feminist ideals, I believed we unravelled notions of passivity, strength, beauty, vulnerability, expression, regeneration, and the rigidity of gender stereotypes themselves. So, has any of you read The Laugh of the Medusa by Hélène Cixous? No? Cool. So, Hélène Cixous, considered one of the founders of post-structuralist feminist theory, wrote The Laugh of the Medusa in 1975. In it she called out to woman, with a capital W, to right herself, that is, to make right the damage done to her sex by writing new textual identities. Cixous asked women writers to construct their own versions of femininity in order to subvert the identities already embedded in the phallocentric discourse of the symbolic order. She asked women to undertake, quote, a systematic experimentation with the bodily functions, a passionate and precise interrogation of her own erogeneity. Cixous was calling for women to reclaim the territory of female sexuality through language, as this crucial part of their being had been inexplicably linked by psychoanalytic theory at the turn of the century to an assumed passivity catalysed by fear of lack or penis envy. In Freud's then still dominant model, woman was subjugated by fear, guilt and shame at her inability to penetrate the world with her own meaning, a powerlessness that supposedly manifested itself linguistically and physically. Sigmund had reseeded an already archaic unwillingness to explore female sexuality in his definition of it as the dark continent of woman. That was all he said on the subject matter, effectively stemming further debate in academic circles and banishing the issue to an unreachable, treacherous and unimaginable terrain. The crux of Cixous' argument was that, quote, the dark continent is neither dark nor unexplorable. Too bad for them if they fall apart discovering that women aren't men or that mother doesn't have one, end quote. Cixous refused to define her identity as one centralised around an idea of lack. She asks women to explore and articulate their own dark continent, plunging into this perceived void of logic to shed their own authentic identities in whatever form they manifested. She insisted on woman defining herself for what she is, what she felt herself to be without fear or guilt, devoid of any sense of physical, emotional or intellectual deficiency. By writing her body into the text, woman, quote, lets it articulate the profusion of meanings that run through it in every direction, end quote, positive and negative, beautiful and brutal. Cixous' woman does not participate in the fixed world that demarcates masculine and female roles and refuses to be the unseen and unheard others. By retrieving the archetypal monster Medusa, whose role as she who would meet the male hero's gaze and turns him into stone unless she is beheaded, Cixous reclaims female assertiveness and subverts notions of power assessed in Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic theory of the gaze. Snakes have always been associated with female naivety or evil in the Western Christian world ever since Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's no coincidence that Medusa wears a crown of these living creatures upon her head. She is the ultimate emblem of uninhibited female sexuality, a serpent-headed empress of the underworld with hypnotic, beautiful and brutal tendencies. Cixous transforms Medusa into a laughing beauty who does not deserve to be perceived as monstrous solely because she dares to meet the male gaze. In this interpretation, we are invited instead to see a fluid entity who resists a fixed form, one not threatened or destabilised by the threat of phallocentric violence, and in whom the many heads of her serpent hair represent a multitude of personalities that woman can employ at any given time. If the presumed weakness of woman was then that she was an indefinable void of chaotic energy, Cixous catalyses the notion that female strength lies in a creative ability to invent multiple identities, rewriting herself constantly in white ink, or mother's milk as she calls it, nourishing new life that does not destabilise but reinforces the whole. Quote, if she is a whole, it's a whole composed of parts that are wholes, not simple partial objects, but a moving, limitlessly changing ensemble, end quote. By embracing seemingly contradictory identities in the same personality, like mother and lover, whore and virgin, the submissive or the dominant, the richness of the whole can only be multiplied. By balancing disparate qualities such as the monstrous and the divine, we can come to a full panoramic appreciation of our true natures. Cixous talks about the, quote, indispensable ruptures and transformations, end quote, that woman must write into her new insurgent language if she is to liberate herself from outdated ideals. These ruptures are the articulation of paradox, real, raw, and incompatible experiences, too at odds with an ideal to be spoken about publicly at the time. Highlighting authentic sexual desires and psychological impulses within the feminine identity, previously swept under the carpet because of cultural disdain, is a way of creating a fully dimensional version of femininity. This all-encompassing version of woman would allow her to transform unspoken weakness into powerfully expressive strengths. Laura Alexander explains, Cixous invites women to think of the self as another kind of metaphorical Medusa, able to express the self in a myriad of regenerative forms. She challenges women to reject masculine ideas of beauty and worth. In the rejection of masculine ideals of femininity, it's important to note that Cixous does not insist on an aggressive confrontation through language with the male. In this approach, for me, she's one of the most convincing feminist writers. She champions, quote, the force and fragility and vulnerability, which can be equal to an incomparable intensity, end quote, and does not seek to challenge men, but simply establish a space of autonomy for women to feel free to express themselves. Cixous' understanding of femininity is one that finds strength in the power of opposites and wishes to celebrate the distinction between the sexes by allowing all to articulate themselves openly. Her essay closes with a discussion of the ultimate female tool, quote, the other love, or the desire that gives, end quote, a creative nurturing force that values opposition and uses the unifying of different perspectives to produce new and unexpected ways of being and seeing. It's an intersubjective state that allows for otherness, but does not view it as a barrier to understanding. The willingness to perceive another's authentic identity while still maintaining a strong centre of your own is essentially the greatest act of love. Quote, when I write, it's everything that we don't know we can be that is written out of me. Everything that will be calls us to the unflagging, unappeasable, intoxicating search for love. End quote. So the act of writing without knowing what will be called for is an ambiguous and bold strategy, as ambiguous as embarking on a love affair, the first brushstroke on a blank canvas, or beginning a poem that is written in a free-fall state. You never know where you'll end up or what you'll be faced with at the end. Cixous even states, quote, it's impossible to define a feminine practice of writing, for this practice cannot be theorized, enclosed, encoded. Continuing, it will only be conceived of by subjects who are the bearers of automatisms, by peripheral figures that no authority can subjugate, end quote. Cixous' essays is not without its problems. Who are these lucky figures freed from societal constraints that can express such a language, and how can they function within a society to effect real social change? Can such an essentialist argument that naturally seems to uphold binary opposition aid a new understanding of female identity? There is one concrete way Cixous suggests such an ideal can be reached. Quote, poetry involves gaining strength through the unconscious, because the unconscious, that other limitless country, is the place where the repressed manages to survive, end quote. Poets, of course, are often peripheral figures who can pop the bubbles of normativity with just a few well-chosen words. So as a young poet myself, and a curious explorer of these exciting new ideals, I decided to test the theory of l'écriture féminine for myself, reworking a famous text with a distinct feminist bias. It seemed an obvious choice to write an inverted version of the Lord's Prayer, firstly because it was something that had been drilled into my subconscious from a very early age, and secondly because it was such a cornerstone of our Western Christian society. And just as a point of interest, how many of you off the top of your head can remember the Lord's Prayer or were taught it in school? It's been drilled into us pretty hard. So, for those of you who don't know it, I'll read through it again. The Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, forever and ever. Amen. So, as you can see, the Lord's Prayer is all about a paternal father figure who lives outside of us, beyond our material world, somewhere in the ether of the clouds known as heaven. He is contactable only through this approved and pre-written prayer, and it takes the form of a verbal contract in which we promise to do his bidding here on earth in exchange for bread, the symbol of material comfort and sustenance, which also links back to you talking about people being classed as the breadwinner, as that being the ultimate goal. We then always ask his forgiveness for anything we may or may not realise we've done, and ask that we can forgive those who are equally wronging us, either knowingly or unknowingly. We then ask that to be delivered from evil, which is a strange choice of words because to be delivered is to be transported by an exterior force to somewhere other than where we are. So we are asking to be psychologically removed from the places we put ourselves in order to avoid exposure to an unspecified evil. We then confirm that we understand he owns the kingdom and that he owns the power over our bodies, spirits and minds. We finally confirm that this will be the case forever and ever. It's a text that reeks of ownership, of a power that is located outside of ourselves, and rewards that are given sporadically when we have earned them through a kind of spiritual serfdom. We are made to remember that the space around us is not ours twice in the text, and that it is his, and also that we are always exposing ourselves to negative influences and at constant risk of polluting our souls or the souls of others through our naturally sinful natures. I'm very much aware that my reading of the Lord's Prayer comes across as being quite scathing, and I genuinely welcome an interpretation of the text that reads these in a more positive light, but that was my personal understanding 8 years ago. So in response, I wrote my own version called Womantra. Our Mother, who is in each of us, through chapped lips your name is muttered, in a blizzard of our ignorance, where self-denial or assurance is nurtured, rock us slowly, gently backwards, till we've dreamt this life away. When given the power to question, did you realise how far we could stray? Cocooned, warm womb of our devising, this numb lullaby diffuses us all. Sweet sobbing whispered melody with the power to dispel and enthrall. Grant us grace to find perfection, if in simplicity it lies. Divinity dwells within us, in our thoughts, our flesh, our eyes. And the nature of creation should be therefore found within the symmetry and brutality of it, her love, woman. So even when writing the first 2 lines of the poem, I realised a huge difference in the way feminine and masculine dialogues work. By simply turning the who art in heaven inside out, making our own bodies a sacred site, I inverted the idea of God being an unreachable outside force and arrived at a much more comforting understanding of spirituality. Seeing divinity as a concept that lies within each of us, accessible at any time through our own efforts and by our own will, stops us from being an empty void and fills us with meaning, however subjective that meaning may be. My version of the Lord's Prayer is certainly not a fluffy narrative that removes us from temptation or pain, as I invoke a womb of creation sobbing because it strayed from the path, blinded by a blizzard of emotional ignorance and neglect. I aim to present a balanced yet brutal kind of female energy, a force of nature that we can literally feel at work in the world around us and respond to instinctively in our own bodies. It was vital to me that I constructed a metaphorical landscape of inclusivity, setting an attainable but equally fulfilling spiritual goals, such as finding the perfection in simplicity and reaching a state of self-love. Not in a selfish way, but in an accepting and regenerative way. It was very important to me to locate our physical and psychological notion of self in our flesh, our thoughts and our eyes, that which we feel, think and see with. As much as I enjoyed the task of writing a feminine version of the Lord's Prayer, as well as many other poems at the time that tested the same parameters, I didn't really feel like I had changed language in any way, or my method of expressing meaning itself had developed in a progressively radical way. Despite acknowledging that my interpretation of feminine language was semantically sculpted by much more visceral metaphors, dreamlike allusions to non-spaces, and the paradoxical pairing of opposites, I didn't feel like I had found a language of my own. Since The Laugh of the Medusa was written, the notion of l'écriture féminine has been rejected by many Anglo-American feminists because Cixous insists on sex as a marker that separates masculine and feminine rhetoric. This can be disabling if it's understood only in a one versus the other paradigm. All you have to do is go on YouTube which I did when I was researching this presentation, and watched one of the many videos titled such intelligent things as "Why Feminists Can Suck My Dick" or "Why Feminists Need to Get Real," to see that the dominant argument is that feminists are man-haters and want to create an avenging matriarchal society to squash and dethrone the patriarchal structures already in place. This is certainly not my interpretation of a successful feminist model. If we cannot stop thinking in competitive terms, then the binary opposition of male and female will always be problematic, and it will never cease to be a battle for supremacy. If we see these definitions as complementary opposites, part of a unified whole, with different things to offer the other and complementary ways of interacting with the world, they cease to be a threat to each other and can become mutually supportive. It must be noted, to return to Cixous, that while she clearly does see masculine and feminine rhetoric as working in two different ways, she does not wish to dominate or exclude the experience of the male or subjugate either. In fact, she believes that allowing both to be present and fully articulate in their own means of expression enriches the experience of all in a symbiotic circuit of meaning production. She clarifies, "I don't want a penis to decorate my body with, but I do desire the other for the other, whole and entire, male or female, because living means wanting everything that is, everything that lives, and wanting it alive." So the task of writing yourself out of a language that has shaped your entire cultural landscape is huge. But as we can see in the formation of street slang, cyberspeak, street art, performance art and subcultural discourses, it's far from impossible to create new verbal and visual systems of meaning. Outside of the institutions, parameters are not so rigid. These new forms occur naturally when the necessity arises and current language systems fail or become outdated. Perhaps part of the resistance to the idea of l'écriture féminine is the fear that the development of such a specialised language would isolate the sexes further and remove men or women linguistically to a new kind of dark continent, where they have no hope of communicating ever again. Perhaps some extremists might jump at this ideal, but it would be a futile course of action. Cixous clearly is not calling for an act of separation when she states, quote, "I want all of me with all of you. Why should I deprive myself of part of us? I want all of us." So the question is left wide open. If l'écriture féminine hasn't been successfully adopted by feminists or changed the status quo in everyday language, where might it have thrived elsewhere? Ruptures and transformations, so why performance art? As stated, my personal background was in theatre. I had appeared in many productions and stage shows, including the seminal feminist production, The Vagina Monologues. Theatre is generally loaded with purposefully placed emotional triggers in its script, the narrative, the choreography, and the way the set is designed. In theatre, we are directed when to laugh, cry, titter, and even applaud the action at the appropriate times. Such moments are carefully planned in the rehearsal process and executed on stage for maximum effect. Theatre is also at least 50%, if not more, driven by its language and wordplay. It's saturated in the same cultural tendencies and ideological trends that inform the society around us. If we are to believe that language has been phallocentrically biased for many centuries, and there is much evidence to suggest that there is, then theatre has not escaped its influence by any means. Has anybody seen The Vagina Monologues out of interest or read the book? I bet many people have been put off by its title. The highly successful Vagina Monologues attempted to subvert traditional theatre, featuring a series of uninterrupted monologues from various female characters who discuss the triumphs and frustrations of their own womanliness. The play was hugely successful, but its technique is very illuminating when considering how feminist discourses can effectively function within mainstream conventions. A monologue is defined as being presented by a single character, most often to express their mental thoughts aloud. It's a powerful way of allowing a character to articulate their inner world, lending a sense of private intimacy and unrestricted freedom to say whatever's on their minds. But it's also essentially a shielded one-way conversation that denies response or the potential threat of conflict or debate. So if theatre raises a question, it tends to answer it before the final curtain falls, wrapping up its own conclusions in a more or less imaginative way, depending on the skill of its creators. Mainstream film is equally geared towards laying out conventional and often predictable narratives that are designed to make us feel a certain way, the rom-com, the slasher film, the film noir. It's only with experimental and art house pieces in both film and theatre that audiences are encouraged to interpret meaning for themselves. That questions are left open-ended, characters keep their ambiguity intact, or finite conclusions are resisted. Art house films and renegade forms of theatre that resist stereotypical conventions are usually rechristened cult classics after many decades of weathering it out. Directors such as David Lynch, Stanley Kubrick, Ingmar Bergman, or the Shoshka sisters have earned their stripes on the celluloid circuit through years of hard slog, whilst touring theatre shows such as the Rocky Horror Picture Show or Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which made radical statements about emerging subcultures and new examinations of gender performativity, took decades to be recognised as game-changing works. Whilst I'm in no way saying that theatre and film cannot express complex political ideas and hold a mirror up to society, as many politically charged releases try and succeed to do, the majority of mainstream productions support a dominant heteronormative white male worldview because that's what sells and are most easily digestible for the majority of viewers. The development of film technology even highlights this, when black skin couldn't be captured successfully by early movie makers and black actors literally faded into the background of certain scenes. The handful of female directors we could list off the top of our head also confirms the still present dominance of the male decision makers in the film industry. In considering all of the above, I very much felt, though I couldn't formulate any immediate solutions, that the language of theatre and film and the expressions they were versed in weren't capable of the full chaotic, euphoric range of emotions I experienced in my life. I'm not afraid to admit that my feelings often shift and change in an instant. One minute I can feel completely empowered and the next completely vulnerable. I'm not a fixed personality, and everything can change with the wrong choice of wording or a positive piece of advice from someone else. I had the growing impression that abstract, non-verbal forms of communication, such as dance, sex, exercise, or physical exertion, something experienced through my body energetically, was the main place I could locate a sense of meaning and find expressions that would regeneratively let my voiceless body and its sexuality speak. It was during Manchester International Festivals in 2011 when I first came across my first taste of live performance art, as opposed to a conceptual critique of it, with the piece entitled 12 Rooms. In it, performers were in different white rooms in various installations and scenarios, such as one who was laid in a bed reciting passages from a book and touching himself under the covers sporadically, or another hanging from the gallery walls with nothing but a bicycle seat between her legs to hold her in place, which is the piece you can see here. Pulling huge starfish poses.
Steph, sorry, can I ask a question? So yeah. Is that like an actual, is that an art piece of artwork, like a painting, or is that a person?
No, that's a person.
Oh,
so this was set up in a gallery space, and originally Marina Abramovich performed it, and she did it for, I think it was something like 8 hours, and the only support that's there is the bicycle seat between her legs and those 2 tiny little foot supports, but essentially it's an act of balance. So when they performed it at Manchester Art Gallery, they had young artists doing it. So Marina Abramovich had trained them and guided them into the piece, and they were only doing it for 45 minutes at a time and swapping. But yeah, it was just an incredible piece of endurance art. You could get as close to her as you wanted. You could stand away and look at her from a distance perspective, but you could get a real sense of being in this hot, uncomfortable, real space. So, did any of you go to that MIF in 2011? No. If you ever get a chance to go and see any Marina Abramovich performances, I would really highly recommend her. She's amazing. So, please feel free to stop me, by the way, if you do have any questions. So pulling huge starfish poses while sweat dripped off their bodies and their chests heaved with the pure effort of staying balanced during their time on the wall. It was an incredible feat of endurance and concentration, combined with a strange martyred sense of beauty. This piece was originally performed by Marina Abramovich, and she had trained the volunteer artist in Manchester to enact the ritual pieces instead. I was absolutely fascinated because of the way performance art utilised real-time, intimate spatial conventions and the living body in a gallery setting where you could move around, get as close or as distant as you wish, and think critically about the things you are experiencing whilst being reached effectively. The performers looked back at you. They could blow a kiss or take your hand in some pieces if they chose. Performing Marina's piece was a cast of all women, and their strength and composure, mixed with a potent sense of vulnerability and raw exposure, had a deeply moving and paradoxical effect. I felt like I'd walked into on a private moment of struggle, an act of extreme endurance embodied in a concrete being that articulated a multiplicity of meanings. Stood not a metre away from the artist hung on the wall, replacing the traditional frames that would adorn a gallery space with a corporal being, I felt like I was inside the performance, that we were sharing a private and unrepeatable moment. So here began an intense study of Marina Abramovich, a Serbian artist whose performance work from the 1970s onwards has been seminal in challenging our understanding of identity and the body itself. She's now described as the grandmother of performance art at the age of 67 and is still hugely proactive. Her most powerful performance was one held in 1974 called Rhythm O, in which Abramovich laid 72 objects out on a table next to her, some designed to inflict pleasure and some to inflict pain, and told the audience that they could use these objects in any way they wished upon her body, and she would present no resistance. Among them were a rose, a feather, honey, a whip, olive oil, scissors, a scalpel, a gun, a Polaroid camera, and a single bullet. For 6 hours, the artist allowed the audience members to manipulate her body and actions. To begin with, the audience was cautious and respectful, but as time passed and the artist remained passive, they realised there would be no repercussions to their actions, and they began to act more aggressively. She later described, "What I learnt was that if you leave it up to the audience, they can kill you. I felt really violated. They cut at my clothes, stuck rose thorns in my stomach. One person aimed the gun at my head and another took it away. It created an aggressive atmosphere." In another performance, Marina sat in a chair in a pair of crotchless pants, with a Serbian military cap on and a machine gun pointed at the audience. Over the course of 6 hours, she attempted to keep the audience's attention focused on her eyes without moving from her position, stopping their gaze from gravitating towards her sex. This was another game of dominance and control, of power plays and identity struggles that involved both the audience and the performer in a symbiotic relationship. Performance art is completely different to theatre. There's usually very little in the way of a coherent narrative, and it often feels like you're walking into someone's private space, into another person's world with their affective responses to certain situations laid bare for all to see. In terms of meaning production, in performance art you meet the performer halfway. There's an immediate energetic relationship between you and them. Performance artists certainly don't expect us to laugh or cry on cue, and are immediately and flexibly sensitive to our responses. They themselves have no cues. They act as their body and the energy of the performance dictates. There's no set narrative, no prescriptive clues or hints as to what you should be thinking about, no definite beginnings and really no clear endings in many cases. Performance art is fluid and in indefinite form that allows for spontaneity and focuses on acts of physical endurance, zooming in on the materiality of the human body and exaggerated everyday actions. Performance art focuses our attention on the minutest detail of our bodily functions and encourages to consider our own in consequence. Falk-Heinrich states, "Body art has evaded representation by focusing on the materiality of the performer's body and presenting concrete life actions in the wake of body art. Theorists began writing on the significance and meaning of the concrete body that was not a reference bearer but was itself." He continues, "Performance art arose particularly from the visual art environment and simultaneously tried to brush off any theatrical representational conventions. Performance art is often seen as an attempt to present an authentic, non-referential event because actions have their own intrinsic meaning within the given context." So, to get to the project of Written in Skin, the poetic potential of pain. Oh, this is a picture of Marina Abramovich from the Rhythm O performance. This is how she ended. So 2 years later, with new ponderings on the nature of performance and its potential as an effective way to express meaning, I conceptualised, along with my partner Loren Fetterman, a professional tattooist and artist, a project called Written in Skin. In it, the stories of an international group of strangers were bloodlined across the entirety of my body by Loren in 6 hours in fine calligraphy script, merging body art, tattooing, literature and fine art. This project had many stages, the first being when we began an online campaign asking members of the public to send in submissions of their writing. From poetry, prose, random thoughts, streams of consciousness, sentences, whatever, as long as they were on the theme of love. Their writing was encouraged to be sentimental, angry, hopeful, sexual, comical, however they felt, as long as it genuinely reflected their experiences of platonic, familial or lustful emotion. The responses we received from poets, musicians, playwrights and amateur writings was overwhelming. The second stage began when these pieces of writing were broken down into fragments and fused in a larger narrative by myself and Loren. This required many drafts, as the colossal amount of writing we were submitted would have been enough to cover 100 bodies. After much editing, the voices of these many strangers were united into one, and the whole process was documented on our blog site. The third stage involved Loren turning the final master poem into an all-over body design of intricate calligraphy that would be bloodlined onto my skin during the live performance. The fourth stage was the live event at the Cornerhouse, in which this design was bloodlined onto my body, and the fifth and most important stage involved a picture diary of the healing process, showing the regeneration of my skin. So these are some pictures from the live performance, and in the middle you can see people making their own poetry. We left all of the fragments that we chopped up and made the master poem out of ourselves on a table in the room where the piece was being performed for people to create their own poems. Written in Skin was designed to literalise the idea of wearing our experience on our bodies, not with hearts on sleeves, but with memories etched into flesh. It sought to illuminate the regenerative and healing potential of love and pain through the interaction of male and female language, the written word, and the embodied physical response. To clarify, bloodlining, not bloodletting, is a semi-permanent form of tattooing without ink, the results of which are akin to scars visible for weeks afterwards that gradually heal and disappear. By literalising the emotional marks we inflict and receive through our experiences of love and our interactions with other people, then transforming them into a customised piece of body art, this project explored vulnerability, intimacy, and the transformational potential of suffering. In keeping with Cixous' assertion about poetry being, quote, a limitless country where the repressed can survive, it seemed like the only way to go when deciding how we would shape the submissions of a group of strangers, turning a multitude of voices into one heteroglossic chorus in a way that represented all people and used my body as a conduit for their communal expression. The goal was always to condense their experiences, a full spectrum of male, female and transgender voices into one, so that the final result was a tapestry of linguistic meaning. My role in the project was as a canvas and as an embodied communicator, a conduit and a catalyst to thought. So in terms of my feminist identity, I felt like I was letting my body express itself in the best way it knew how, in a non-verbal and wholly visceral visual language. My endurance, as well as my strength, and the sense of elation I would feel after the ordeal, or what I saw as a personal rite of passage, was the ultimate way my body could write itself and express meaning. My body literally wrote itself in response to the words being scratched into it, the projections and conceptualizations of love that had been pre-written by others, in the scabs it formed after the words were scratched into it. My body wrote itself honestly and authentically in the way I responded during the performance and the way it healed afterwards. In the weeks that followed, I had to face a society that assumed I had either mutilated myself, been mutilated by someone else, or had contracted a terribly disfiguring disease. I joked to some that I had the most intellectual form of scabies ever, and about 25% of people laughed. Most important to me was the way my body absorbed and replaced these markings with clean, fresh skin and took the writing and the experiences of others into itself in an act of embodied poetry. I obviously thought a great deal in the period of time leading up to Written in Skin about how my feminist identity was being portrayed and expressed in a multitude of ways, how I would be perceived by those coming to watch. I was fully aware that some might see the needle of my boyfriend's tattoo gun as a phallic symbol and the whole act of bloodlining as some kind of sadomasochistic castration complex compensation. but there was no point entertaining these fears of how I might be perceived, because at the end of the day, any performance artist or piece of art is a mirror, and people will project whatever they have inside of them onto what's in front of them. I felt like I was successfully protesting at the ideals of beauty, fragility and vulnerability attributed to women, as well as displaying my openness with my real body, how proud I was of my flesh, and how willing I was to let it express itself however it saw fit. I wore no makeup during the actual event. I made eye contact with everyone in the room that came to see the piece, including the youngest guest, who was a boy of 3. I made sure this was not done in a confrontational or challenging way, but in a smiling, loving way, so that everyone could see that I was not being held under duress and was completely happy with the position I was in. I had previously thought I might be able to make it through the 6 hours in some kind of calm, centered, meditative state without speaking or breaking my concentration, but I actually found my inner strength in singing the words to the soundtrack we had made, which ranged from Tom Waits to Justin Timberlake to Haltz. I watched everyone as they walked around the room, watching me, and their energy and warm curiosity gave me limitless strength. We gave people the same fragments of the poem that we had broken down ourselves and turned into the master poem, and encouraged them to recreate their own versions and write them in the visitor book, which were then uploaded onto the website. We surrounded our performance space with 12 music stands in a magic circle, with the master poem displayed on them for all to read at their leisure, and this also stimulated movement around them and gave them multiple perspectives to view us from. I can't stress enough that while some people undeniably couldn't get past the nudity, sexuality, pain and inferred kink within the piece, which I'll not deny were present, what really mattered to Loren and myself, and what seemed to permeate most, was the tenderness, respect and love that was constantly passing between us. In the last hour of the performance, my body started to go into shock, and as we'd started from my face first and worked our way down to my knees, and all of the pressure and pain I'd been holding in my body finally had to find a way out. This was the moment Loren and I had to make a decision whether or not we would stop or carry on, and I turned my back to the audience as a flood of tears started to gush involuntarily from my face. With only 30 minutes left to go, and being the proud woman I am, I felt I couldn't end the piece there, and we continued, with Loren whispering in my ear how much he loved me and how proud he was of the art piece we created. People saw this interaction without hearing the words being communicated, and the energy of that gesture rippled through the room and caused the biggest and most moving response of all. To me, the most important part of the entire project was documenting the healing process and showing how the body will always regenerate, that it is tougher than we think, and that we can push ourselves beyond unimaginable limits with the right frame of mind and determination. Loren and I went to Greece quite coincidentally the week after to one of his friend's weddings, whom I'd never met, and the bride's first question when I met her and she saw my face was, "Can you please not spoil my wedding pictures?" Many people before the event told me that I was going to damage my skin permanently. I even had comments along the lines of, "Why would a pretty girl like you want to ruin her skin for life?" People seem to have no concept of the long-term meaning and seem to be dominated by fear of an irreversible mutilation and a loss of some kind of stereotypical beauty. Loren and I even had to convince our parents that what we were doing was a genuinely felt and intellectual art piece, which I'd like to say we did, until we showed them some media coverage we'd received in the alt lifestyle magazine Bizarre, which was right next to an article entitled "The Only Time I Get Perved On Is Whilst Making Porn" by Randy Seagulls. But I digress. Conclusion. So, through Written in Skin, I believe I embodied a kind of feminine identity akin to Cixous' Medusa, who in her presumed monstrosity, as a darker symbol of sexuality forged through suffering, actually articulates a process of positive transformation if you are willing to see past the labels a culture would brand her with. The locating of beauty in her traditionally diabolical form is a direct protest against the way our culture categorises threatening modes of feminine sexuality. My body, my meaning, literally articulated through my skin, spoke of strength in pain, of the harmonious balance of opposites, and of the regenerative powers of love and self-love. This could only be achieved through performance art, because it was the only medium that allowed my body to become an effective and spontaneous frontier of language, capable of absorbing harm, hurt and conflict, and reflecting back a multitude of subjective interpretations. Performance art opens a space for a kind of creative process that is as confrontational or passive as the audience chooses to make it. The audience perform a dynamic heightened by the fact that many of the attendees had submitted work to the project and could see their writing being bloodlined into my skin, heightened a sense of communal ritual. My body became an almost shamanic receiver and redistributor of a powerful new kind of meaning, one that the attendees could connect with in many ways, depending on the nature of their own inner worlds. Loren's presence was vital to the performance, as between us we represented the polarity of the sexes. By bloodlining conventional language into my skin, he was both the inflictor of pain and the creator of art itself. His role resisted being fixed in place just as much as my own. We offered a panoramic view of meaning production in which all forms of expression such as art, pain, love, language, poetry, sex and the body were present on both concrete and abstract levels. I believe Written in Skin was such a successful performance because the parameters and meaning shifted at will, depending on the perspective of the viewer and the spontaneous action at its centre. Even we didn't know exactly what was going to happen in those 6 hours. I firmly believe that it's in the presence of the other, whether that's another person, or another personality, or another space, any position where societal rules of representation and identity formation are suspended and questioned, that one's own sense of centeredness or difference is brought most powerfully to the forefront of our attention. During Written in Skin, I flickered through personalities, depending on the projections of the audience, as an exhibitionist, a muse, an artist, a victim, even a martyr, and my body was, as Cixous so beautifully puts it, a spacious singing flesh, alive because of transformation. And I have a video time-lapse of the live event if you guys like to see it. You can see how I started off to remain all calm and composed and ended up by the end of it flickering right. It's even better because it's speeded up. I look like some kind of crazy muppet. I'll show you the video. Do any of you have any questions or any comments whilst I put this on? Hi.
What words did you have written on?
I could read you the master poem if you'd like. The words, the way we chose the words that would be written on, and like I said, we asked strangers to submit writing, anybody could enter, and then we chopped all of their submissions down into fragments and then returned it into the master poem. So the idea was to create one unified voice from as many different experiences as possible. So this is the poem that was bloodlined onto my skin. I want you to think about love, this little hope that's all there's left to feel. A mystery invites investigation, a centre in a world of unending unreal. I find myself mesmerised by words on buses and packaging and people's skin. I'm confused about what I was reading and why. In meaningless scribbles there hides a religion. I fill the silence with perfect words. I'm wondering without allowing conclusion. We don't know what is true, but let's dream the same dream, of silver in the warm blue sun's diffusion. In the darkness, our little world stretches no further than the tips of our duvet. Awake in the shadows of beginning and ends. Are you scared? I am. We'll be okay. Did you hear that? At night this ghost slips into your room. Ripe young flesh passes through your fingertips, a fitful vision of love in bloom. I turn to look at you. You're weird and you're short and your mum tells me you're gay. My glittering friend, tender stranger, a dying planet far, far away. A beautiful fluency flows in your secrets. I allow my mind to follow the rhythm, deadly to the foolish, tender to the brave. I looked so deeply I breathed you in. The effects are a bit like LSD. Your brain processes faster and makes new connections. Romantic shuddering now in a brighter place, rotting my flesh and sucking my senses. Beneath the desert, on the outskirts of sanity, morality melts as I decompose. I have fought mutation by freezing maggots, in space and in silence alone. I scan my eyes over many Medusas, before me like a carpet spread out on the floor. You might have no business sleeping with virgins. Why do my dreams always feel like a war? I've run out of reasons to ever turn back. The time is right now, this dark night takes hold. Within hours I knew the secrets of the stars that haunt and guide us from young to old. My adolescent longing lies demolished, reduced to horizontality. I wonder if they are really asleep, or confronting imagined morality. A girl in my class once told me with such conviction it had to be true that if I misbehaved then Jesus would know. He interrupts, I fall out of time with you. Surprises unfurl their cinematic wings, confusion reigns, frogs can fly when you don't make them feel self-conscious about it. Challenge what you think and why. I want you to think about love, this little hope that's all there's left to feel. Allow your fingers to touch without purpose, a centre in a world of unending unreal. So as you may gather, some of the submissions we were sent were really angry, some of them were really positive and beautiful and hopeful, some of them were about words themselves, some of them were about a kind of struggle to communicate, and yeah, we condensed it all into one 15-verse master poem. And I'll play you the video so you can see the actual live event. I wonder if we've got sound. Oh no, we've got sound. Oh, there we go. There was no way I could have done that after 6 hours. That had to be the first thing we did. And you can see at this point, I'm quite calm. I was managing to hold it in well. I was terrified of sneezing when he was doing the tip of my nose. biased either. We're actually doing another project on the 31st of January at the Cornerhouse again, because we were discussing the other day, if there's a l'écriture féminine, then where is the l'écriture masculine? Like, where does that exist? And we were looking into this on the internet, and it actually only seems to be a dominant theory or discussion in France, which is where l'écriture féminine was also originated. So our project in January at the Cornerhouse is a completely different format. We're going to be creating a huge mechanised wheel, and it deals with notion of time, of man's need to control and categorise time. And I'm going to be strapped to the centre of a giant 10-foot timepiece that's going to be spinning for 6 hours whilst Loren paints, again, the writing of strangers on the theme of time, cycles, patterns, repetitions of repetitions in our lives. So yeah, that should be an interesting parallel to Written in Skin. Do any of you have any questions or anything you'd like to ask? I suppose my question to you is, how successful do you think I was in presenting a feminist identity, or unsuccessful, or how could it be problematic? Do any of you have any thoughts?
Say, for example, what you did is play around with demonstrating pain on the body, and it's clearly you empowering yourself by doing so, and it's a good thing that you did, but it's not getting the collective movement to change, say, a view on feminism, perhaps.
I think it is. I think it presents a model of femininity that isn't frightened of pain, that isn't stereotypically labelled as something that needs to be cloistered and protected because it's a weaker sex, and it's something that isn't capable of something that isn't capable of being exposed to pain and transforming it into a positive way. I'm not in any way suggesting that all women should go out and do projects like this, or that that's the only way they can express themselves. But I did just really want to challenge these ideals of the weakness of the female body, or the ways in which beauty is located as well. I think that was one of the main things that most people kept coming up with, that it was that why would I do this to myself, like why would I mutilate my skin, and the only reason that would even be an issue is because of this cultural stereotype of beauty and what we can and can't do to our bodies. And you go to cultures on the other side of the world and cutting lines into your head, various lines in Africa that marks where you are in your tribe. Or I think it's just challenging notions of what we can and can't do with our bodies and ideas of beauty.
Anyone ever had a wax? That's pretty bad.
Exactly, yeah. Piercing. Staying up till 4 o'clock in the morning writing, and I felt super empowered and super positive in my own skin, and that I had proven to myself that the body has these incredible. There's no limits really on what you can do to yourself, if in a safe environment, I suppose, in a controlled environment. But I felt super empowered. And then afterwards, I think it was the only time I started to feel any negative effects was when I went out into society, when I had to start going to the shops. So like when we went to Greece, we went to the airport, and people were literally falling over their suitcases, like trying to read my face, but without looking like they were trying to read my face. And I had loads of little kids that were coming up to me, and they were just really curious. The little kids are like, oh, like, what's going on? What have you done to your face? And I was chatting to them. They were fine with it, but it was all of the adults. And there was this one woman on the plane. She was awful. She was sat there talking to the person sat next to her, thinking I couldn't hear, going, "That's disgusting. Look at her face," which is fair enough. Like, you're allowed an opinion, but it's just that like, oh my God, she's not orange and blonde, and like, what's wrong with her? So, and then we went to Greece, and I think there was only one Greek man that was nice to me and was just, you know, looked me in the eye, treated me like everything was alright. Everybody else would kind of look at me and then look away and be terrified to make eye contact with me like I was contagious or wrong in the head, which is fair enough. They're allowed to do that. But yeah, it wasn't until I started going out and interacting with people that I actually started to feel uncomfortable or wrong in some way. So I think that speaks volumes. Any other questions?
Would you ever do it again?
Well, that's a really interesting question because that's what everybody asks. And it's not something that you could do all of the time. It's not something that you could do like every year because my skin would be completely destroyed. My skin is fine. I mean, you can still see when I get hot. You can still see the writing on my arms and my legs, which is quite interesting. When we were in Greece and we'd been going swimming in the sea and then in the sun, all of the scars really thickened up, and I looked like a book. I looked like I'd been turned into a leather book. And that was when I thought, I'm never going to be soft and feminine ever again. But yeah, so it's something I think I would do again, but not anytime soon, and definitely not a regular thing.
How long did it take to heal?
My face took about 4 days, and the rest of my body took about 2 to 3 weeks. Your face is amazing. Your face will heal really, really quickly. And also I had quite an arsenal of skin products to scrub my face with, and all of my friends would be giving me flaxseed oil and things to. I think going to Greece was the best thing we could have done. We didn't plan it. It's not like we were like, yes, I'm going to sojourn to Greece now after our art project. It just happened by coincidence. But I tell you a really interesting random thing. We went to a cave in Greece, which was underneath the temple of Athena, and there was the modern temple of Athena, and then there was the original older temple of Athena, which is basically just a cave with a kind of like a platform set into it. And I loved this cave. This cave was awesome. We climbed up there many times. We weren't supposed to go up there. And when we came back to England, I looked up the cave, and it's in Lindos. And I actually found out that it's the cave in Greek mythology where Medusa was turned into a gorgon by Athena, because in the story goes that Medusa was a young, hot, virginal woman hanging out by the seaside in Athena's temple, and then Poseidon came and raped her, and Medusa was weeping because she'd been raped, and Athena, who is kind of this symbol of, who was a symbol in Greece of like this ultimate femininity, who was like this real masculine femininity, who was the protector of Greece, and she was a warrior woman, and she cursed Medusa because she was crying after being raped by Poseidon, which I think is quite justified, to be a gorgon. So I thought that was a really interesting little bit of synchronicity. And also that in Greek mythology, if a woman's raped, another woman will come along and turn her into a monstrous creature because she's crying about being raped. I just think that speaks volumes about the way in which certain cultural institutions have framed the male and female discourses and how men and women should and shouldn't act. So that was just a weird little coincidence.
Andy?
Quite a lot of what you're talking about in terms of things you want to challenge and themes that move through the work are about discourses or structures of social order and life. But the work was very intimate and local and specific to your body. I wonder if you could say a bit about why you chose to challenge structural things that you're talking about at the level of your specific experience.
Because I think that's what performance art does best. I think it reflects the macrocosm through the microcosm, and I think my body and the experiences of other people being put onto it, that's very personal. You know, people sending us their writing about love, that's a very personal, closed, intimate experience. But the statement we were trying to make was, it's a larger issue, it's a universal issue about the things we suffer and endure, ultimately making us stronger people. So I think that's what performance art and a lot of art does really well, is it localizes and simplifies an idea and then people will experience it on a subjective level, but then they can go away and think about it on a much, much bigger scale of how that ripples through societies and communities, and how it affects them. So does that answer your question? Yeah? Cool.
And I think it was helpful as well, linking into the lecture part, that you started off by saying, like, hey, you're the rebel subject. And I think you can really see through everything that Steph said about her in kind of very sort of conscious intentions and intellectual intentions in this respect, in this project, to kind of create these different meanings, and to kind of, in doing that, try and subvert these kind of dominant codes and dominant kind of norms that you have to conform to. And even though, like, within your project, I guess, and what you had sort of done to you, if that was maybe within it, is a quite extreme example of using your body and creating these different meanings. But in some ways, it's something that we all kind of more normally do in everyday life. You know, when we talked earlier about the clothes that you wear to try and express a sense of self that's maybe a bit different. People just having tattoos in general, there's quite a lot of stuff on just tattoo as a form of protest. You know, so sometimes it's fashion and stuff, but sometimes when people use their bodies to try and craft different meanings away from the kind of dominant ones, you can kind of see it as being part of those cultural struggles over meaning. But it's, like we said earlier, it's quite an individualised way of doing it.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think the more complicated a question is, like, the more radically you have to respond to make a point, I think. And I think the idea of, I think that's where it comes from. Like the Pussy Riot example, like, I think they had to express themselves in a way that was so radical in order for it to ripple through. So.
All right, well, thanks very much. If we could just say a big thank you to Steph for giving us the time. And Andy's going to pick up some of these things on the body and protest in lecture 8, actually, so we'll look forward to that. But in the meantime, I won't see you next week, but I'll see you a week after. All right, thanks very much.
Before you go, next week, Monday and Tuesday, there is a teamwork challenge that you can become a part of in order to have something to say in interviews.